Right?
Yeah, anytime you're ready.
Okay, I want to welcome you all to this session. I hope you're all at
Did you just say that? Quiet.
at ease. Okay, you know, the last session was really wonderful because so many people talked about their own stories. And actually that was good because that actually was going to be the conclusion of this talk. Right? This talk is going to be talking about processes and so forth. The title is about the Summit Tunnel and what's next, right? So from my perspective, it's a little bit different. We're going to be talking about how do we go about nominations, how do we go about preservation and so forth. In this case, we're using the Summit Tunnel and the effort to try to make that place a national landmark as a sort of example. But what I'm going to do is go back to some of the history and the background for how we were able to get, how we came to select the Summit Tunnel, how that became a priority for us, and what it actually means for us, especially Chinese American Citizens Alliance, in terms of the role that we play in historical preservation. So I hope that we can do that and still stay on time. Notice that we'll always be watching my back, not necessarily back, but watching to make sure that they're doing.
Thank you for taking this on, Ted.
Yeah, so it's really, like I said, it's really great to see people like Betty, who was from the very beginning a supporter of our 1882 foundation. And of course, Sue Fong is always working on things that we're doing now. We're doing some things on rural China and Hong conferences. We're thinking about having that in Utah. But let me go back a little bit.
Tell them when the conferences, they might want to go.
Oh,
Su Fan's book, The Chinese in the Woods.
Yeah.
Who knows about what the Chinese did in timber and logging? Su Fan does.
yeah, Sue Fong knows more than that. She knows all about Nevada. Oh, you're going to be giving a speech tomorrow, so forget about anything here. Go to the conference tomorrow. Okay?
No, go to the conference in
Oh,
June.
So we, 1882 Foundation and the state SHPO from Utah are jointly organizing a conference to be held in Salt Lake City. That will be mid-June, and it will be called Rural Chinatown and Buried Sites. It's going to be a little bit on the archaeological perspective about Chinatowns that people have forgotten or lost. And so keep that in mind. That's coming up. It's going to be a little bit of a academic type thing, but it's everyone's welcome because we always have a lot of fun.
What does SHPO mean?
SHPO is the State Historical Preservation Office, and so we'll be doing that. And we're also going to be co-sponsored with the National Trust for Historical Preservation. So, and anybody else, hopefully Chinese American Citizens Alliance will ship in too. Anyway, I wanted to start with the idea that the topic of this is the Summit Tunnel. And of course, everyone knows when I say the Summit Tunnel, you know what I'm talking about, right? It's the place where the Transcontinental Railroad across the Sierra Nevada mountains, and it's built largely by Chinese labor. And our efforts have been to recognize that as a national landmark if we can't get it made into a national monument. And that's a big deal if we can get it done, but I think it's very deserving. So let me walk you back to some of the processes of how we did it. And that also tells you about what you might have to do if you want to nominate a historic place or any of that sort of thing. And you can understand some of the politics behind it, because I think we got a little bit of criticism for some of the efforts that we made, but maybe this can help explain some of the things. So in 2009, after I returned from overseas, I used to work in the American embassies and consulates. So then I came back here and I started working at the Department of Homeland Security. And I was working on immigration reform. And I had done immigration reform in the 70s and the 80s and now. So I kind of remember a lot of the changes and stuff like this. So we were doing that, and I was getting ready to retire with a bunch of other people, all ex-vets. If you ever want to get a body of people that sort of like time to check out that path I once could have walked on, I didn't take. That was you look for the retired vets. So anyway, in 2009, we started thinking that, you know, I was working at Homeland Security. We have a chair for you.
There's a
Come on.
sitting there.
Yeah.
There's chairs. Yeah.
We got two here.
So I was working with Homeland Security,
I got it.
and I was giving a talk on some great topic, like it was called about how does the immigration quota work, something which intrigues everybody, right? So it was a lawyers' conference, and I went down. It was in Seattle, and I saw an exhibit there by the CHSA, and that was called Remembering 1882. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's really a quite good exhibit. It still resonates very well.
There's a booklet.
Yes, there's a little booklet that goes with by Connie Young. You wrote it, and that's still a very good exhibit. If you ever find it, show that. We have a couple of copies. Anyway, at that time, I sort of decided that I was going to take that exhibit and bring it to Washington, D.C. because nobody really cared about quota control at the time. So I went over, took the exhibit, got it to Washington, D.C., showed it there. It was quite revealing to a lot of people, and so then that people who saw the remembering got a lot of attention. And when it was shown, and just to let you know, I had committed myself, I was going to take that exhibit about 1882, I was going to take it and put it in the immigration department's lobby. And so I did that after, so there was a little bit of resistance, but I was able to take that exhibit, put it in the immigration department's lobby, and then I was going to return it back to San Francisco. But Sue Lee, who was the director of the CHSA at the time, said, look, Ted, you're showing at it, people are getting attention, just keep it in the East Coast. That resulted in a number of other people being interested in saying that, sometimes people aren't quite aware of all the immigration issues when you're not on the West Coast. When you're on the West Coast, those issues are pretty much in your mind. I mean, you know about it. But in the East Coast, people found that it was really something new. A group that was now the United Chinese Americans, they're made of largely of first generation Chinese, largely on the high base. She saw Tom Yutz's Ted. His group, made it mostly, as I said, from China and first generation Chinese, we're going to walk to Congress to talk about immigration, different issues they're going to advocate, like many of us have done. At the same time, I was actually asking the CACA representative in Washington, do you want to help us promote this exhibit? At that time, I have to say, apologies to everybody with all CAC, that I wasn't really quite sure if CAC was even still active. Remember, it was my father's organization. I remember that very clearly. And then I said, is CACA really still active? But then Carolyn and Munson and these people were coming on this annual Washington visit. And one of the representatives, Tom Lee and Alex Chan, says, these guys are coming. So I invited you guys to come attend a meeting that had the UCA. It also had George Wu from OZA, because I had already talking with him. And we all got together and said, shall we adopt a resolution to ask Congress for an apology for the 1882 Act? And that's how it all began. So it began with that meeting, and we went up to Congress. And at that time, we were talking with Mike Honda, because that was our contact person, right? Mike Honda said, this is a good resolution, because he had already sponsored some resolutions on recognizing Chinese fighting in the American Civil War, right? But he said, with this resolution, you should make sure that the Chinese American representative has the first chance to make the resolution, right? To draft it. And at that time, it was either David Wu from Seattle or Judy Chu, who had just got elected in Congress. So we had talked to David. I'm glad we didn't choose him, because he later got in some trouble. But Judy came in, and she says, Ted, when you walked into my office with this delegation of people to promote this, I was saying, I don't know if I can do this, but I have to do it right. I don't know if it get passed or what needs to be done, because she's the first time representative. But we all got together and we met in our office and we decided we're going to do this. I didn't know what I was doing. And other people, but eventually people started coming. It was almost organic. People saw this resolution, which was to apologize for the 1882 Act. Because Congress had passed in 1882 and it was rescinded in 1943, but there was never any recognition of the harm that it caused or acknowledgement of that sort of thing. So we said, oh, we need an apology. At the end of the day, to make a long story short, we got a number of people getting together. We got other Congress people who supported it. And we got very critically 5 national organizations to come together. CACA, OCA, UCA, JACL, and Committee 100. All these are national organizations that have a background which we could go through to help promote the passage of this legislation. And the other thing we had later was a law firm called Covington and Burling. That was a really big step. We had originally asked them to just give us a briefing on what do we actually have to do to get a resolution done. How do you draft it and so forth like that. And so that was moving. Covington and Burling, especially by a senior attorney, Martin Gold, was able to not only advise, but they said, we would like to join the effort, pro bono, right? So it turns out Covington and Burling is one of the largest, one of the most well-known and respected lobbying firm in Congress, right? They had actually passed legislation related to Ho Feng Shan, who was a Chinese diplomat in World War II that actually saved a lot of Jews during the World War II. He's one of the only non-Jewish people in the Holocaust Museum, honored at the Holocaust Museum. So their organization did that, and they were ready to help us. We had to make the argument why they should do that, but they did, and they helped us throughout that process. It was invaluable. So we formed a committee of 5 people, plus 5 organizations, plus Covington and Burling, and we drafted the legislation. I mean, the wording and all this, and we tested out certain words, what we could do, what was the strategy, how to go about doing it. At the end of the day, one of the things that came about it was that we could not really get an apology, the word apology, without it getting shot down by various senators. So we said, let's compromise. Let's make sure it's something like expression of regret.
Yes.
All right. So that turns out to be one of the criticisms after we had passed it. But they don't understand. We actually tested the words at different congressional offices and so forth. And we said, let's do this first. We'll do it as a 2-step process. We'll do it in Congress, both the Senate and the House. We'll try to do both through something called unanimous resolutions. And then after that, we'll go to the president, because you don't need the president for a signature on these sort of resolutions. But we go up to the president, and by that time, all the objections, the political objections that people had would have been done. And in fact, we got unanimous resolutions from both the Senate and the House. There's another story about how the House got passed, and that's another story, but it's really a lot of fun. But at the end of the day, when we went up to go to the next step, to get the president to sign off on a proclamation that says, I apologize on behalf of the government, we couldn't get it passed, because, we couldn't get it past the White House, and because at that time, people were saying, enough already, right? This is, we don't need to do this now. We already got this resolution passed in Congress, and we're going to do, on the May APA Heritage Month, simply a letter saying that this thing had passed. All right, we didn't think that was adequate, but we didn't want to fight any further, went away, because the opposition to it from certain political sections was not really from non-Chinese. When we had 5 organizations, the organization that actually most opposed it was actually OCA. OCA New York, because actually they had good reason. Their opposition was, if we could mobilize people to pass this type of resolutions through 2 compounds, we should reserve that energy and that effort to get the population ready to support immigration reform and judicial nominations, right? That's what their point. And they felt the resolution wouldn't even get passed, but OCA joined us anyway. The other people were a little bit lukewarm. It took us a little while to get to maybe 100 and other people, but they all did join toward the end as we were getting closer to actual passage. It did get passed. One of the things, the observations to notice is the main organization that carried it off consistently and passionately was CACA. You were the guys that actually went to the offices of the various districts and sat in their office waiting to talk to the principal, right? And so that taught me something, that CACA, despite all the sort of tensions we as an organization have had with OTA, thinking that we get involved in resolutions or other political efforts, OTA then steps in, like in the one whole case or other things, that they stepped in, and they're a little bit more politically adept and something of this sort. So they seem to take a lot of the credit for things. And so CACA sits back a little bit. But in this issue, the one to remember is this, that it made a big impression on me. CACA is passionate about this thing, and they are knowledgeable about the historical aspects of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So that's number one to remember. Anyway, the process went forward, and I wanted to say that so that's moving forward, but we couldn't get it to the president's office to sign. We couldn't get past the president's, the guys that the APA representatives in the president's office, the White House, the liaison people, because they were largely OCA groups. We said it's done for now, right? The thing that we thought was, we'll wait for the next administration, right? I mean, at one point I had asked Conrad Ng or other people to try to help. Conrad was Obama's nephew, right? And he said, no, we'll finish with this for now, because everybody had fatigue, right, to do this. But we thought, never mind, we'll wait a little while, and then we'll get the next president. But she didn't get elected, right? So the result was, okay, let's wait for the next administration. That's 4 years, because I wasn't going to do something that, one, he may not agree, two, he may use in some different way, and three, I just didn't want Trump. Never mind. So anyway, we waited for now, and now we have the new, we kind of revived some of the ideas, but anyway, that's how it is. In the meantime, we're still working on other issues.
Better hurry.
So other issues, for example, our 1882 Foundation was actually thinking of ways, part of our foundation effort was how to broaden public awareness of the 1882 Act, how to develop best practices among public educators, museums, and historical societies, and how to create teaching material, right? Teaching material, integrate stories, history into the curriculum. So that's another thing we could talk about, strategy, how we did it. Our position was that we would look at standards of learning and how to integrate Chinese American topics into government, into politics, into history, rather than the current effort by many people to sort of say, let's have Asian American studies as so many credits separately, right? Because that raises the question where if you're a teacher, you say, that sounds good, but when am I going to have enough hours to teach all those topics? So why not better look at the standards of learning? And I have to teach about government principles, but is there a place or a resource where I get Chinese examples that illustrate the separation of powers or the rights of citizens and so forth? And that was our focus, how to work with the states and standards of learning so that it includes examples that were that illustrated Chinese or Asian issues, right? So, and that continues to be our strategy, which is interesting because now, after the anti-hate movement and so anti-Asian hate movement and so forth, that is the approach many people are beginning to take, right? So anyway, while we were doing this, we were also working on how do we look at issues of historical preservation and storytelling in an era in which government funding was being restricted, right? How do we do that to make sure that we can maintain story programs and research? So that's very much like things which CACA has always talked about, and Manson has always talked about. How do we work with making sure that tax credits for historical preservation are maintained, that sort of thing. We started looking at how do we do public-private sponsorships of programs. So the example that we started using was Gail Hong's program with Greenlook Museum and that heritage tour through the Pacific Northwest. That became one of the things where we said, this is an example of public-private can work together. And so we tried to, in fact, the second tour to England was actually on our insistence, working with Dale, right? But then we said, okay, we want to expand that example, illustration, to California. Because California had all the rich examples of things going on there. We could do it in Washington, we could do it down here, down Washington. But that then got us involved with Sue Fong and Munson and Southern California guys. And we could never pull it off because the week-long tour, which is what the Heritage Tour did, didn't lend itself very well for the private sector people that we would have to run the organizations. Sue can talk about that later because she was also part of the idea, what do we need to have on the bus to go 1 week on these trips. But 1 week on a bus with everybody seeing things is a little bit long, even if it's kind of interesting like this, unless you're some sort of a history student or college education, it doesn't work. So then that was going on, so we're still looking at different ways to how to improve relationships between public-private sponsorship. So the Forest Service was introducing things like roundups. I don't know if you guys know that term, but they were trying to experiment with how do you work with the Chamber of Commerce in the various festivals that were people going on, and you start emphasizing Chinese American contribution or Chinese contributions to the development of that place. So many of the things that are happening now, like different localities sharing festivals, working with Chinese to talk about the history of that local area. That's what the roundups were about. But they were figuring out ways of how to make sure they could pay for themselves, right? So we were out there trying to do that. At the same time, an organization called API HIP started up. And that was with, Munson knows because he introduced me to time hours at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And she was working with me, or wanting to work with me on some things. And for those of you guys here from California, you know the Hanford China Alley was actually nominated by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I actually registered as a National Historic Place. The announcement of that was how many years ago? I actually wrote the introduction to the announcement that we did in Washington, D.C. Today, part of the trip here this week is actually to go visit some of the people there because they had an unfortunate fire there, and they're trying to renovate the place. So anyway, Tanya comes up to me and says, this organization called API HIP was having their second conference in Los Angeles. I remember that. And she asked me, is there any way you can help them a little bit? And I was saying, well, they got really a bunch of great people, but I'll tell you what, I'll go ask Conrad Ng, who has just arrived at Apex Smithsonian, and says, there's a group in Los Angeles, why don't you go be a keynote? Something like that. And so he says, well, I'll look into it. And so he went over there, and that's how that second event came about. But the third event, let's start talking about doing something in Los Angeles again. And we, now in the Forest Service, working with the Forest Service, we're trying to do a heritage tour. And the heritage trip, 1 week long thing, wasn't working out. So we said, let's do something where we do an overnight trip to a place close. It was the conference was in San Francisco. So anyway, let's do something there it's close enough to Summit Tunnel. We'll do a night trip there and come back and say that's how the Summit Tunnel got started. It was actually an add-on to the API HIP program, right? And that went on really well, like this. So that's how it came about. But at that time, the summit tunnel was not a primary objective for us. At that time, what we were interested in is how to develop public-private relationships, or how to develop self-funding programs, right? So that we continue our programs going forward. So one of the lessons, another lesson to learn is make sure your network is there, and that you would take advantage of it. And just say, okay, let's try to join resources. And so it was such a successful trip that the Forest Service decided to give us no-year money to try to do it again and again. And this year, they're thinking about renewing it for the third or fourth year, right? And so what that meant for it, and so that's another thing where I think about where the opportunities for finding funding comes from when you do something, right? And so don't be afraid, try it. So one of the other things we decided to do with the first trip, we said, let's see if it can even be done. We didn't know the schedule would work. Then we tried to say, okay, can I advertise and promote it? And it was very successful. Third time we tried to do this, let's make 50% of the seats available for teachers. So we worked with the UC Davis group, and they filled up half the seats, and that was also a total field. Next week, we're going to do the fourth or fifth trip, I forgot what it is. And that, we announced it, within a week, it was all filled. So it's been very successful. We think it can be expanded. And so that is one of the things we're looking at. How do we increase the ideas of heritage tours and so forth like this? Now, again, the summit tunnel was not our primary objective. Our objective was figuring out ways to how we could collaborate with others and have self-sustaining heritage trips, preservation history, and that was our main objective. But as we began looking at the tunnel, going there to visit, talking with people, there is a sudden, not a sudden, but an immediate realization. This is an important, critical site. There probably is no other place that can match the summit tunnel in terms of its ability to impress, its enormity, and its significance to the building and construction of the American nation. You can imagine, if they're not for the summit tunnel and that building of the transcontinental road, how much would be affected or not have happened because of the inability for the economy and so forth. And so what we talk about when we talk about the summit tunnel is that this is one of 3 national projects by Abraham Lincoln for the building and unification of the United States. So we placed that thing squarely in American history, which is what, and we talk about it in those terms, right? Still, when you talk about that, 80% of the workforce or 90% of the workforce was Chinese labor, right? And so, and it was skilled labor. The more you look at it, and I think Su Fong will talk about it too, the more we look about it, it wasn't just laborers, laborers knocking rocks and pushing things. They were skilled crews, they were doctors, they were engineers, but also just people who had skills, whether, doctors and so forth, and that allows us to expand in different ways. So the summit tunnel becomes the higher priority for us, right? We're doing other things, but it becomes a priority in itself. It takes a life on itself. So we decided we're going to make this a national, we wanted to encourage it to become a national monument. When you look at the summit tunnel, you have to say, why isn't this already a national monument? Right? You really have to think about it. Why isn't this already a national monument? And there are some reasons which we have to work at, and so that's another story. But that's how the summit tunnel actually became so prominent in our history. Now, in our efforts. Now, we could not get the summit tunnel itself designated, or we feel like it's very difficult. It's like you're looking for compromises. Union Pacific, you have to ask the question, why is it not already a monument? And the answer has to be, or actually you have to ask, the owners of the property. In that case, the Union Pacific, why have you actually failed in promoting this history or talking about the significance of this. That's actually a dereliction of what we should be doing. Union Pacific would say it's supposed to be this company that cares about American history and so forth. So that's the way we're trying to balance the thing. And we think we cannot, that in order to get the designation national monument, the owner of the property has to agree. Right? And so they're not in that position yet, right? But the landmark status, we don't necessarily need their agreement, but it's good to have their agreement. And the other part of it is we decided, let's focus on the China camp, which is next to the railroad passage. That doesn't belong to the Union Pacific. That belongs mostly to the Forest Service. So what we did is an archaeological nomination for the China camp. But in order to talk to the China camp, about the China camp, we have to talk about the railroad, right? So the Union Pacific knows this, we know this, everybody knows this. But for the Union Pacific and others, it's a way to get away from that administrative issue. Well, it's not just administrative, they have some good reasons for it. One is they actually don't run tracks or trains through there, but they use it as a way to get to the active tunnels. If there's an emergency, then they have to go. The thing that we keep saying to them is, you can still use it anytime you want, and certainly if there's an emergency, you can run through that. The expectation is that we got a grant from the Department of the Interior to do an archaeological study of the place. That becomes a nomination, which is given to the Department of the Interior, and I had expected that it would have been done this year, right? And the nomination was expected to be fast-tracked through the Department of the Interior, and then they can announce it. The other way to do it is to get Congress to pass it. But so we're expecting it to be done this year, but it looks like it's been delayed until the spring of next year, right? Because they say the pandemic has piled up all these nominations and so forth like that. So that's the process we're going through. But we feel very confident that selection will happen. But the other part of the work on the Summit Tunnel is the development of an interpretive center, trying to establish a center on site right there. So that's one of the efforts we're doing, and that's kind of moving forward. Mellon Foundation has suggested that they might help us fund that, so that's good. But more important, we go back to some of our original principles, how to get public-private collaboration to build the thing. So we have ideas, and they have ideas, and we're trying to still work on that. I'm fairly confident we will have something, but you still have to be a little bit patient. Now, I'm not totally patient because this year is also the 80th anniversary of the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act. That's December 17th. And it's also the 250th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision on Wong Kim Ark. Both are monumental historic decisions, right? So what we are going to do, we have proposed that in December 17th, we would have a reception or some kind of event there, and that would be done at the Library of Congress. So that's in the works. Among the things that we have asked is we've asked the White House, can the President send over a letter for our event? And so those of you who have done that know that. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work. But the White House liaison person, very different from the one we were working in 2019, saying, look, Ted, let's go for the moon. Instead of the letter, why don't you get a proclamation from the President? He said, okay. So we'll see what happens to that. I don't know. But you guys ought to mark your calendars. We're originally wanted December 17th, that's the anniversary, but because that falls on the date in which Congress is not in session, because they're all the Christmas break, then we are probably going to move it to December 14th, which is a Wednesday. So if that happens, and among the things I also asked the White House is, can you check on the status of the nomination for the Summit Tunnel, because I understand it's in a pile of other things. So if you know how that works, if the President asks you, well, what's the status of this thing, and you're not trying to change any of the decisions, just say move it up. maybe something will happen. But I'm hopeful that he would say something and maybe Secretary Haley would announce it. There's certainly a lot of efforts by this current White House to make sure that some of the Native American sites are being nominated and selected and so forth. So I don't think it's impossible that something like that happens, but that would be a great presentation to finalize both the Summit Tunnel and the conclusion of what we started in the 1882 project, where we were seeking a presidential apology. If that can happen, that would be wonderful. And for CACA, it will be the fulfillment of one of our long-lasting resolutions, right? To get actual apologies and things like this for these historical preservation hearings, historical preservation questions. So that's moving forward. There are other things that are going on that relates to like the Kurt Lee nomination for Congressional Gold Medal. And so that's another one that's pending. And we hope that that can be done. And we can see that from the gold medal effort and all this other stuff, that core organization, going back to that first observation I made of the 5 national organizations that represent Chinese Americans, the one that is the most passionate about historical preservation, the ones that have the actual stories, like in the last session when you were here, you could hear people saying, my restaurant, my this or that. Everybody has a memory of the father, grandfather. That adds to that passion and persistence. When I was talking with the Union Pacific, in the several times that I talked to them about various things, and I'm always very nice, and I should be nice, because they could fund the whole thing if they wanted to, right? So easily. So you know, the guy here, representative here in Washington, was saying, "Hey Ted, you're still working on this, right?" I said, "Yeah, of course I'm still working on it." He says, "You know, you're the one group that has stayed persistent from the first several years ago when we started doing this. You're the one group that stays persistent in asking and developing the case for the Summit Tunnel to become a national monument." The point here is that you all really make a difference. The CACA, that is, to me, I've been working with different Chinese national organizations in Washington and political areas for a long time. And I appreciate very much the various differences that are there. And it really is something CACA should really take pride in. When you decide what our national mission is, when you start deciding what our goals, of course we're going to deal with Black Lives Matter, we're going to deal with certain legislations and so forth. But honestly, the one area where you make the most difference, and because that OCA cannot do very well, C100 can't do very well, UCA can't do very well, is this thing about historic preservation. And that historic preservation begins with you're telling your story. So the last session, it doesn't matter how small your story is. One of the core functions for 1882 is that we call it talk story, which is tell your own story. Fundamentally, it's a big issue. I remember Shu, where she was saying, "How do we do talk story?" I said, "Isn't it supposed to be talking stories, or is it about talk stories?" No, it's a concept that started out in Hawaii back in the 1960s when we were doing Asian American literature and so forth. So it's about us telling our own stories in our own voices. And that begins with each of you stepping forward and just recording the stories. Like, you don't have to write a book, you don't have to do a movie, but those are all good. But begin by going home and say, once a month, let's tell a story, gather together a story. And what we say in the talk story process for 1882 is, it is actually the process of gathering together, of us gathering together to remember and share our stories. And maybe we'll make some new ones too. But the point is that allows us to be a community that's sharing and telling and remembering our stories. One of the things so there's a couple other things I'll close off with, is that we are actually scheduled to do something with the Kennedy Center in August in 2024. And the theme of that is going to be talk story. And what I want to do is invite all these guys that were some of the original people that advocated the idea of Asian American literature. When the only books that were available was Roots, I.E., and so forth like that. So now there's dozens of writers, and we've come such a long way to do it. So on August 2024, we're going to have an event at Kennedy Center called Talk Story. And it'll be sort of like a semi-dinner something. We don't have enough money for a real banquet, but we might have banh sandwiches and bottled water. But the point was for us to go back to remember the original concepts of what Talk Story was about. And so that will be in August 2024. So please come for that. The other thing we have is I circulated, oh, by the way, I kind of one of our, if you got this, which is a black and white issue there, it tells some of the concepts that we have and what we're trying to do in the 1880 Foundation. And in the back, you got, if you're lucky enough to get one of these, it just says, DC Chinatown Rediscovered. And it just has a blank box. And it says something like, more than a place, our stories, our voices, our community strong. The idea of not putting any image here, but don't get caught up also in the idea that you should have to have pagodas, that you have to have curved leaves, curved eaves and things of this sort. Our story is as much our story in America, and in fact it is the story of America, and not necessarily replication of what is done in China or done in Chinatown when they try to Disneyfy the place, right? So it is probably better to preserve some of the places that we have as frontier villages, as frontier sort of outing structures and things like this. The other thing is that we established, and that's the other flyer I point out, is this Chinese American memorial at the Congressional Historic Cemetery in Washington, D.C. It's a small thing. It's a place with a couple of benches and a plaque, and you have some pictures there. In the early days of the Chinese American experience, most of the guys know that after a person died here, and usually if they're a bachelor particularly, then after a certain while, their bones are disinterred and they're shipped back to China to be buried at the villages, permanently buried in villages or in the district. That is important, so important, because what happens is that it is through these bones that you have this connection to ancestors, but in some cases, like my ancestral book goes 2,000 years back, right? And it's the connection that allows you to go 2,000 years forward. That's a very important thing. So that was done, and then in the historic Congressional cemeteries, and this is a fun cemetery. Have any of you guys been to the historic Congressional cemetery? Yes, you've been there. And I'm not talking about the Congressional cemetery in Arlington. I mean the cemetery in Arlington. That is a great cemetery too for a lot of people. But this one has been around for a long time. It has cenotaphs and illustrations. There are presidents, ex-presidents, FBI. Director J. Hoover is buried there. Malakovich is buried over there. There's a number of American Indian chiefs that are buried there. Very significant place with a whole range of Civil War and other people. And both South and North. There was a section where the Chinese were also buried. But because the bones were disinterred or people ignored it, it was simply a blank place. So if you talk about a symbolic representation of Chinese history disappearing or gone, that was what was left there. It was nothing. There's no tombstones, nothing there. So we decided we're going to mark out that place, put a couple of benches, and put this memorial. So this memorial, we just finished it. We dedicated it in April this year. And I described it there. And one of the things I'm pretty proud of is we raised the money ourselves. CACA paid half of it, CCPA paid half of it. Half of it was $4,000. So we were able to build this thing, and the important thing for us is that we wanted to create a database. So there's the central part, which has Toisan, the Samyup, everything listed in the middle part, in Chinese traditional characters. That is to represent the origins and the culture and the places that we came from. The red bricks around them are individuals. Individuals in association. I put one for CACA, and that's there. And there are people like Hazel Lee, things of this sort. So anyway, these bricks, anybody can put one there, as long as you have some kind, that person has some kind of American connection. So your father or somebody you want to put there. Send us the money, get a brick. We'll get a brick, we'll put it in. But there is another addition requirement. You have to put in give us a small story of who that person was. 250 words. You can also add some images, and that creates a database for us. That database, of course, is open to anyone. So if they're actually a collection of many stories, many oral history stories. So if you have a memorial being built in Portland, or another memorial that has the concept of recording the local individuals and so on, go ahead, do that. But why don't you also send in a copy of something to our larger database? I'm hoping that that database becomes a national collection of short stories for all of us to share in the future, right? And that way, all of us can contribute to this larger database of stories.
Ted, that is great, but may I, representing Northern California, share the t-shirt and the DVD that's available to tell the railroad story? So Will Lee made these for the 2019, the big, so we could add, he did a nice design, didn't he? And it has the two Chinese characters, Ti Lu. In Toisan, it's Jane Ti Lu. You build the railroad. We could add the Summit Tunnel to the back, and then every lodge could get, who would like to order the t-shirts. We have bamboo hats, if you want bamboo hats from China. Then there's a 28-minute DVD that Lonnie Ding made in 2001, and you can, each lodge can get a copy of the Canton Army in the High Sierras.
So that Lonnie Ding's film is very good. We also created one with the Forest Service. It's shorter, it's better for you to talk, use for talking, which is, that's called Heritage. And that's why I left the postcard for you. It's actually available on YouTube. And the other thing is we just completed another one called Tracing History. And that one is about a mother-daughter going through the Sierra area. And people say, and it's very touching. That's only like 8-10 minutes, something like this. The shorter films are good. Everybody wants to do a 2-hour film because they want to get it on the PBS. But you should create something no more than 30 minutes, because that's the time. This allows you to talk about it. The other thing is that there are certain principles, public-private collaboration, Chinese-American citizens alliance is central to a lot of things. Aim for the big projects. Think about, do all your individual stories, do all of these, but look at the big projects. There's nothing that has as much impact right now as making the Summit Tunnel a national monument. I don't think there's any project right now, whether it's in San Gabriel or anything, that will have that kind of impact to the public. And so look for the larger projects. And then in the back of this, I have some of the projects that we are working on continuing to. And so the one thing that is not mentioned here is that we are looking for another funding, something we call If Buildings Could Talk. And that's to develop the DC Chinatown and use their exterior spaces to be exhibit spaces that tell stories. If the building could talk, it'll tell you what that restaurant was like. It'll tell you that all these sort of things were happening. And our goal is to connect that with the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian, so that we start sharing exhibits, and you do that digitally, right? So one of the things I think this is a final remark. Some people are really supportive of the Asian American National Museum on the National Mall. That's all fine and good. Grace Mung produced a resolution to have that begin to evaluate the feasibility of it. A lot of people know that that's like a 20, 30-year project, you actually realize. But in the meantime, why not look at these networks that you're building? Look at the original. Smithsonian had another project that was announced just before the Grace Mung's legislation was moving forward. I think that's great as that's moving forward. But the other early one was they were going to take a wing of the American History Museum and make that into a permanent APA place. That would be a perfect place to exhibit, for example, the gold medals and things of the sort. So we actually started talking about, okay, how do you display the Chinese gold medal, Filipino gold medal, and so forth. So that's there, but that is mostly, and the ideas we're talking about, how do you do it through a digital process? How do you connect with the regional museums, with the Chinese historical, you know, the CHSA, or New York, or Boca, and things like this? Because you don't want to think that there is the regional museum. The regional museums do great work. We should support it. And the way they support it is to build a network that's connected together. Imagine if I could go to Washington, D.C., or I could be here in Las Vegas, and I walk into a place and I say, I want to find my mother's registration record at the National Archives. That is one of the connecting points that we would like to have. So you could go there, find it, and you go there and you say, hey, it says she arrived on a ship to San Francisco at Angel Island on such and such date. We would add that data so that you could sit there and go to these different places and find this complete story. That's what we hope to be the National Museum for Asian Americans. Asian Americans, each community has its own section too. Chinese, Filipino, and depending upon their resources, they can add, subtract to it. So we don't have to worry about physical space, the limitation of physical space, which kind of becomes very confrontational sometimes. Okay, I'm sorry, the time's up, I think. If you guys have any questions or comments.
I do have a comment. I want to thank Brother Ted for at least a couple of shout-outs, one to ourselves, and you should be very proud, CACA, and then the other to a funny outfit that he said, API, Asian Pacific Americans and Historic Preservation. And the first, it was on my watch that we started the apology resolution, as Paul knows. And then, as a part of API HIP, I am one of the founding board members and officers as well. So I think, thank you very much for saying that. The idea of knowing our heritage, the idea of bringing back and remembering and historic preservation and talk stories is one of our efforts to approach equality and parity in our American citizenship. If we are not seen as equal, and we don't feel that we are equal, then we still haven't got it. And our original 1895 vision is still to be achieved. American citizenship, parity and equality, that's what it's all about. Thank you.
And the second part is to make sure that the other communities know it. Actually, there's only one community, American community, and that we need to let them know that this is a fundamental part of our story, the larger our story. So when we get that point, that's our goal, right? Yeah.
I just want to thank you, Ted, again, to remind all of us that what the CACA is doing is ongoing. As Ted just said, we went through all the steps, the hardship to bring our issues to the, national attention, bring up congressional, say the apology bill, the congressional gold medal bill. We do not stop there. Ted's examples of continue on education, for the public to know us, that has not stopped, and the CACA is still in the forefront to do that through local history project, preservation project, or not, but national focus projects such as some of the tunnel things, as well as your idea of talking about adding a wing at the American National Museum as a Smithsonian. I think that is so important because that shows that our story is just not about ourselves talking about it. Sue Farm has been championing that with National Trust in Dog Preservation, all in all. It's bring our stories to the forefront as we are part of American stories. And thank you so much, Ted, for constantly working on that and to remind us. And I think CACA can play, continuously play an important role. I think we do not want to step back and just say, we have done that. I know it's a hard work and we don't, but there's much, much more work we can do. As Ted keeps on reminding us, it's a joint effort, then we can collaborate and continue the success. And thank you so much, Ted.
Remember, yes.
You brought up very quickly, but I think it's very important that we're going to try to get an apology.
Right.
That would be a very unifying act. If we get that done, trust me, CACA is going to be even more cohesive, and I would throw all my weight behind to help you too. And I'm sure many more.
Yeah, you know,
Write to Congressman.
yeah, exactly, write a congressman. And the way you do that is not necessarily write about before the apology, but say, how come the Summit Tunnel is not a national monument? And it's the finding of these national monuments, these national events. Kurt Lee's nomination that we had on our table at one time to get the Congressional Medal of Honor, that is long overdue, and that's still one of the unfounded resolutions. But once you get these things, they get national attention rather than just the little things. And it's those adding up. Hey, we fought for this country, we built this country, and we should be seen as part of the country. That is what it is about. So, December 17, I've always said it every year for the past 5 years. December 17 is each lodge should go and do something simple with their lodge. Like I would say, on that day, show a movie, show a film, some things which Lotus had mentioned. There's a lot of different things. Just do an event. If it's just you and 3 or 4 people sitting around the sofa eating popcorn, fine. But the thing is just remember that day. When the Japanese apology when the Japanese got a presidential statement, however many years ago, that statement became the day that was established for the Day of Remembrance. So every year, the Smithsonian, I was just there talking to about it, they have that Day of Remembrance at the Smithsonian. If we can get something like this from the president, it's not just the apology that ends in itself, but we get established what we have tried to get at one point, a day of inclusion, right? And is a really worthy goal if we could do that. So every year there's something that talks about inclusion and diversity.
May 6th.
No, don't do it. No, don't do it in May because May is already overcrowded, right? Do this on the day that the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed. The whole term, the Day of the Exclusion Act is gone, and it becomes Day of Inclusion and Diversity. Right?
Endorse it, please.
All right, that concludes it. Lunch is next, everybody. My favorite. Yeah. In a moment, yeah.